So what I thought I'd like to start by doing is, first of all, wishing you all a very happy Women's Day to all us feisty ladies, and to welcome you to my home here in Stockholm. And to that end, I wanted to just show you some images of where I am. Just quickly start with that. So that is the view into our courtyard at the moment, a summer view. You can see there are flats, other blocks of flats around us. That goodie in the middle is a barbecue, a braai thing. And you can see the benches and the leaves all in full summer. The building opposite is a community hall, and above that the garage where Pete's car is. And then here is inside my living room, where the musical appreciation gatherings take place, but in the afternoons. So you can see we've got bright red couches. There's Lucy on the floor. Ladies from all over the world there. Nearby nature reserve. It's about a 15-minute walk from here, called Järvefeltet. And then here also is a spot we can cycle or drive to this. This is the swimming area in the lake. It's about a 10-minute drive from here. Now this is not sea, it's Lake Mälaren. Stockholm is an archipelago of islands situated in the third biggest lake in Sweden, Lake Mälaren. This theme for today is hidden gems. And of course, most of us who love classical music, who attend concerts, listen to music at home or in the car, can't always perhaps put a name to the music that we know and like, but we recognize it. So by the mainstream music that you will recognize, I'm talking about the Beethoven symphonies, Mozart symphonies, the well-known Beethoven piano sonatas like the Moonlight. There's a lot of classical music that we know and recognize and perhaps can't always put a name to. But this morning, my purpose is to draw your attention to some of the hidden gems, and I'd like to do this again next month. I was discussing with Amanda, so because there's a bottomless pit of hidden gems in classical music, and this can be music either by well-known composers who you already know, but pieces of theirs that are seldom played, or music by contemporaries of the big names of whom you may not have heard. And those are the interesting people to whom I'd like to draw your attention. As always, and especially because it's National Women's Day in South Africa, I'm going to include a woman composer, always part of my ongoing crusade to draw your attention to the other side of the composition coin. When we include the women composers in talking about our Western art music, it of course gives us a much fuller picture of that history. You only get part of the story when you think about the male composers. So in these strange times, I'm going to start on a cheerful note with some wonderful happy music by Handel. And part of this exercise is to remind us that Handel was initially a composer of opera before he turned to writing sacred oratorios, like the Messiah, with which we're also familiar. And he and Bach were, of course, the principal composers of the Baroque era, German Baroque composers. And Bach wrote no opera, but Handel had even been to Italy and studied writing opera there. And he relocated to London, where his erstwhile boss in Germany, the Elector of Hanover, then of course became his boss in England as George II. And it was during this period that Handel composed his operas, about 50 operas altogether. And some of them are still performed today. And what you see in the right-hand slide here, right-hand picture, is a photo I took of this opera, Assis and Galatea, that I saw performed at one of the two little Baroque gems, little opera houses that were closed up for up to 200 years and then reopened by feisty entrepreneurs in the 20th century. So This is called Confidenzen, the little Baroque theatre at Ulrichstall's Palace, just outside Stockholm city centre. And this was a performance I saw last autumn of this particular opera. So Handel's operas were at first very popular in London, and he engaged star opera singers like the castrati, including Farinelli, of whom you may have heard, one of the most famous castrati of all times. And at first his operas were very popular. Then over a period of time, taste changed and his operas weren't so popular anymore. The British started preferring pieces like John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, and his opera company actually went bankrupt, and that's when he turned to writing oratorio. Anyway, this opera, Assis and Galatea, is what we call a pastoral opera, a courtly entertainment about the simplicity of rural life, and it contains a significant amount of wit and self-parody. The secondary characters, Polyphemus, the giant, and Damon, provide a great deal of humor without diminishing the pathos of the tragedy of the primary characters, Assis and Galatea. So the story in a nutshell is about this nymph, Galatea, who falls in love with the shepherd, Assis. And they are warned by the chorus. This is very much like ancient Greek theatre, where the chorus comments on the action. And the chorus warns them that the monstrous giant Polyphemus is jealous of their love and that he's approaching. So Polyphemus duly murders Assis, and Galatea mourns the loss of her loved one. So this little theatre, Confidenzen, you see in the picture that I was telling you about, was restored after having been closed at the when the assassination of Gustav III of Sweden took place in 1792. And the theatre was alternately used for various purposes, including as a stables for the royal horses. But they reopened it, refurbished it, and this was all under the auspices of the king's sister, Princess Christina, and Kirsten Dellert, quite a mover and shaker Swedish opera singer who died recently, but she was instrumental in getting this place reopened and tarted up. Anyway, let's get to the music. So first of all, the Sinfonia, or the overture to this little opera. Please give me a thumbs up if you can hear it nicely. Can you hear the music? And then next from this little opera, I'm going to play for you a delightful duet, Happy We, where Assis and Galatea sing, and this takes place at the close of the first act.
Happy, happy, happy,
Staying with the Baroque, my next piece is by Handel's very famous contemporary that I mentioned earlier, Johann Sebastian Bach. And these two were, of course, the towering figures of the German and English Baroque, respectively. Now, it was Bach's task when he moved to Leipzig for the last phase of his career to compose a new cantata for St. Thomas's Church, where he worked and trained the boys in the choir, for every Sunday. Of course, this would have led to a lot of self-borrowing if he was running short of time. He is famous not only for his wonderful sacred music and organ music, but for having 2 wives, one after the other, and 20 children altogether, which included a pair of twins. And 3 of his sons, in fact, became famous composers in their own right. But he was appointed cantor at St. Thomas's Church, which you see in the photo there, both the internal and external photos that I took when I was there. In 1724 is when he composed the piece that I'm about to play for you. And cantor means basically the chap in charge of the music of the church, to be the organist responsible for the tuning and maintenance of the organ, composing the music and training the choir boys. He also taught at the St. Thomas's School nearby. He taught the boys there maths and music and Latin. So you will probably be familiar with his well-known cantatas, Sheep May Safely Graze and Sleepers Wake, both based on Lutheran chorales. Martin Luther was a composer in his own right as well. And at the time of the Reformation, which he basically launched and triggered, he composed ordinary, simple hymns for the German people to sing in German, getting away from the corruption of the Catholic Church and everything being in Latin. And what I also find interesting is to compare Handel and Bach as personalities and as musicians. On the one hand, we've got Handel, who's very flamboyant, Catholic, Southern German, traveled and studied in Italy, spoke Italian, was very joyfully melodic. His music, in a sense, lighter, if you like, definitely more melodic and less complex. On the other hand, we've got Bach, the dour, devout Lutheran from northern Germany, wrote much more sacred music. His music is more complex, it's much deeper, it's more intellectual and definitely more conservative. So let's listen now to part of this cantata by Johann Sebastian, in English now, Come, Saviour of the Heathens. what you could hear coming through there, ladies, was the fact that you get the basic German chorale hymn tune coming through in and out, and around it is all this fancy orchestral accompaniment and choral sort of interpolations in between. And this is the genius of Bach in all these dozens of cantatas that he wrote, that the basic hymn tune threads in and out of this rich Baroque contrapuntal texture where there's a lot going on at the same time. So next, on a more contemplative note, and very far removed from 18th century Germany, I've got the beautiful slow middle movement of Shostakovich's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was composed in 1957 for his son Maxim's 19th birthday, and Maxim premiered the piece during his graduation at the Moscow Conservatoire. Both this concerto and the concertino for two pianos were written to be accessible pieces for developing young pianists. So they're not monstrously difficult pieces. And my purpose here in drawing your attention to this beautiful piece, and I won't play the whole movement, it's too long, is to draw your attention to the fact that Shostakovich didn't only write his heavy, sometimes very acerbically dissonant Soviet symphonies, those very long, almost, well, very heavy works, very intellectual works. This second piano concerto is, I think, not just for his son, but a reflection of the very tough life that he had as a composer in the Soviet Union under Stalin. So he had a life where he was sort of praised one moment and lauded as a great Russian composer, and then reprimanded, vilified, and just about packed off to Siberia the next moment. He and Prokofiev also. And Prokofiev actually found it so unendurable in Russia that he moved to America for a period. But he became too homesick. He found he couldn't live outside of his homeland, so he moved back to Russia. Anyway, let's listen to a little of this beautiful and subdued but very romantic middle movement from this piano concerto.
Roger just
Okay, you get the message there. And I encourage you to listen to the rest of this concerto on YouTube. One can source so much these days free of charge online. It's really terrific. So my next composer, next piece is by my woman composer of the day, especially as it's National Women's Day. And as you can see, her name here, Germaine Taillefer, she died relatively recently in 1983. And she was actually born Germaine Taillefesse in France in 1892. But as a young woman, she changed her name to Taillefer to spite her father, who had refused to support her musical studies. She began learning the piano with her mother and composing short works of her own at a very young age. And she was accepted at the Paris Conservatoire, and there she met a group of composers who you may not have heard of, but Francis Poulenc is quite well known, Darius Milhaud, Georges Auric, and Arthur Onego. And they were part of a group that came to be known as Les Six, the Six, a significant group of composers active during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in France. And they moved in and lived in Montparnasse and the Montmartre arty districts of Paris. And here she also met Jean Cocteau, playwright, artist, impresario, and Henri Collet, Ravel, and Diaghilev. She won prizes in several categories of composition at the Paris Conservatoire. Many of her most important works were composed during the 1920s, including her first piano concerto and her harp concertino, a little of which I'm going to play you just now. She also composed ballets, including for the repertoire of the Ballet Suédois, the Swedish ballet, and ballets for Diaghilev for his 1929 season, for his famous Ballet Russe. She also wrote several pioneering film scores. So quite a lady. After the war in 1936, she returned to France from America, where she had gone with her American husband, whom she later divorced, and wrote another interesting work, La Petite Sirène, which is based on Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Little Mermaid. So here is part of her concertino for harp. Gabriel Fauré composed this piece. in 1864-65 called the Cantique de Jean Racine, and that's why I've got a picture of the great French 17th century Baroque writer who was one of the giants of the French Baroque theatre, along with Molière and Corneille. So the 19-year-old Fauré set this text for a composition competition at the École Niedemeyer de Paris and won first prize with this piece. Fauré was an organist, a pianist, a teacher. One of his teachers was in fact Saint-Saëns at the Paris Conservatoire. And next year, by the way, talking about Saint-Saëns, we celebrate 100 years of Saint-Saëns, 100 years since his death in 1921. And Saint-Saëns is going to be the subject of one of my summer school courses, what Madi calls a course. It's actually a double lecture, a 2-hour or 1.5-hour lecture. And by the way, summer school is going to be online next year. No campus contact and vibe, unfortunately. But at least that means that my friends outside of Cape Town and indeed in Europe and America can join us for summer school. This is the piece that I'm going to play you next by Gabriel Fauré, sort of a French impressionist. let's get to the Copeland ballet. So if you were enjoying a little bit of contemplative time now, this will wake you up. So this was composed, of course, in the last century, and you can see that Copeland lived to the ripe old age of 90. And what he was trying to achieve in this contemporary music context was to be able to compose open, bearable music in this hotbed of dissonance and atonality and all the isms of the 20th century, Dadaism, Cubism in music as well, atonality, active mostly in the 1930s and 40s with this concept. He deliberately set out to compose music that was more accessible, more popular, and indeed in a more vernacular American style. He wanted to capture the sound of American music. And I truly believe he succeeded in doing so. So you're probably familiar with his other ballets, Billy the Kid and Rodeo, and possibly his other popular pieces, The Fanfare for the Common Man, and his Third Symphony. He also wrote chamber music, vocal works, opera, and film scores. Especially listen to his interesting percussion.